In popular Western movies, cowboys are always the flawless heroes, and Native Americans are portrayed negatively. However, the historical reality is quite different from this cinematic representation. Women from various Native American tribes led lives that many women today might admire. They were respected for their skills and played crucial roles within their communities, something unimaginable for many European women of the same era, who faced severe restrictions on their rights. When you dive deeper into Native American culture, it's surprising. Contrary to what many Hollywood movies suggest, these societies weren't based on stereotypes and simplifications. They were complex, with rich traditions and a deep respect for the abilities and roles of women. By the end of this analysis, you'll have a better understanding of the challenges millions of Native American women have faced throughout history and the pressures they still face today. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were really impressed by the social organization of the Iroquois, so much so that they were inspired by it to shape American democracy. In the Iroquois Confederation, women not only participated but led many aspects of public life. They played key roles in ceremonies, religion, and the organizational processes of the tribes, while the men focused more on social roles. Interestingly, it was the Women's Council that chose, and if needed, removed the chiefs, showing the respect and importance of women's roles in the tribes. Additionally, when it came to sexual traditions, the Kaga tribe had a custom that made many men nervous. Young men of the tribe had to spend a night with the oldest woman of the tribe, and she had to be satisfied. If not, the young man would have to be re-evaluated. In many of these communities, women often took the initiative in marital relationships, flipping the traditionally expected roles of men. Sometimes, when the men of the tribe felt overwhelmed by the attention from the women, they would just escape into the forest and hide in shelters they had prepared in advance. If several men fled, the women didn't hesitate to organize search parties to find them and bring them back, making sure they fulfilled their responsibilities in the tribe. Speaking of extreme situations, during wars between tribes and against invaders in the conquest of the Wild West, it wasn't just the men who fought. Women from various tribes, including Omaha, Cheyenne, Ponca, Sioux, and others, actively participated. They weren't just reluctant participants. They were skilled warriors, handling weapons with the same expertise as their husbands and brothers. For example, there were times when the Texas Rangers faced the Comanches, and according to their reports, they made no distinction between killing men or women. They believed that the women were even more dangerous than the men because they never surrendered, always attempted surprise attacks, and fought until the very end. One of the stories that emerged from these conflicts is the legend of a Cheyenne woman nicknamed Ten No Nails, who became famous for the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. The legend says she was the one who took down George Custer, the American leader in that battle, marking one of the greatest victories of the Native Americans over the invaders. Captain Robert Custer, who fought against the Comanches in the 1870s, described a Native American woman warrior in one of his letters. He spoke of her as someone who fought with the ferocity of a tigress, using a bow and revolver with great skill, a true manifestation of wild strength and desperation. The stories of these women confirm their extraordinary courage and remarkable combat skills. Clearly, it would be hard for anyone with sexist ideas to underestimate them or suggest their place was only in the kitchen. Moreover, the family structures in these tribes were quite unique for their time. Most practiced monogamy, but polygamy was also accepted. For example, if a man was completely satisfied with his first wife, he could ask her sister to become his second wife, even without the consent of the first. This kind of practice was normal for them and was part of their legends and traditions. One of these legends tells the story of two sisters who lived alone until one day a man came down from the sky and taught them about agriculture and cooking. According to the legend, this experience justified each man having two wives. Additionally, the tribes had interesting methods for dealing with the scarcity of men and controlling birth rates. In the past, women in certain Native American tribes could take on the role of temporary wives. This arrangement ensured that they wouldn't remain single or childless, a condition that was well regarded by everyone in the tribe. When we think about marriage in that indigenous society, they had a pretty practical approach that in some ways resembles our modern view of relationships. Young couples could live together, and if for some reason the relationship didn't work out, they simply separated. This kind of flexibility only became common in civil marriage much later, in the second half of the 20th century. A curious fact about how women were valued in these tribes is how European colonizers exploited this esteem. Noticing the respect that the Native Americans had for their women, the colonizers often captured them to force the tribes to stop fighting and negotiate. In the past, some traditions in Native American tribes were quite different from ours today. For example, when it came to divorce, women had a lot of power. If a man came back from hunting and found his things thrown out of the hut, it meant his wife didn't want him around anymore. He couldn't complain, and his only option was to move back in with his mother. There was also a rule that the husband had to live with his mother-in-law for at least 2 years. The man had important responsibilities, such as ensuring his wife's childbirth went well. It was also expected that the woman would give birth every 4 years. If it took longer to have another child, it could cause dissatisfaction among the tribe members, and other women would start investigating the reason for the delay. Another interesting point is about a big misconception many people have about Native American girls and tribes in the Old West. Contrary to what many think, it wasn't the Native Americans who were savage or dirty, but rather the colonizers, who had quite questionable hygiene habits. It might be hard to believe, but our notions of hygiene and cleanliness today were very different centuries ago. Back then, many of the first colonizers, the Pilgrims, didn't practice hygiene like we do. For them, water wasn't connected to personal cleanliness. Being clean just meant having clean clothes. If someone was well-dressed, they were considered clean, no matter how they smelled. In fact, strong body odors like those from manure or horses were normal and even expected in a cowboy. Lice and fleas? Those were seen as common too. Additionally, around 1620, the idea of cleanliness had a strong religious aspect. Some saints believed that suffering on earth, even avoiding hygiene to create open wounds, was a form of devotion. On the other hand, Native Americans who loved bathing in rivers and lakes were seen as savages by the Europeans simply because their habits were different. The early European settlers had a very different view on bathing in rivers or waterfalls compared to the indigenous peoples. For the indigenous people, it was a natural practice related to cleanliness and purification. The settlers, influenced by their older and more religious traditions, saw it as something indecent or even blasphemous. This difference in perception is quite interesting, especially considering that much later, in the 15th century Europe, the habit of bathing in bodies of water became common. Today, this practice of cleanliness is even glorified in Western movies, showing how perceptions can change drastically over time. It's also interesting to note the resilience and beauty of indigenous women, who, despite all the adversity and aggression they faced, remained well-groomed and respected by their traditions. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, photos of indigenous men and women show the richness of their clothing and accessories. They wore elaborate outfits, often adorned with fringes, embroidery, and beads, along with accessories like earrings, necklaces, and bracelets that were not only aesthetically impressive, but also carried deep meanings related to their culture and history. Today, many of these traditional elements even influence the world of contemporary fashion. Indigenous women adopted various body adornments like piercings, rings, and chokers, and they also used homemade beauty products. They often applied natural cosmetics, different moisturizing oils, hair dyes, and homemade shampoos. Some of these recipes are still popular in modern cosmetics today. However, not everything was so advanced and positive for them. There were certain peculiar customs and prejudices. For example, when they were menstruating, women were considered impure and had to stay away from men, especially during meals. There's a story about a Native American named Uisaka, who once attacked his grandmother before a meal and forbade her from eating with others. He claimed that her impurity could attract the wrath of the gods and endanger the lives of all family members if she ate with them. In sedentary indigenous tribes, women generally received more careful and affectionate treatment. On the other hand, in nomadic tribes, the situation was quite different. Although they had the right to participate in choosing leaders, nomadic women were often treated like property. They were responsible for all the household chores, took care of the children, and attended to their husbands. This reality sounds somewhat familiar, doesn't it? Additionally, in nomadic communities, older women were seen as a burden. They received less food and didn't enjoy the same pleasures as younger women in sedentary tribes. The situation for older women was particularly difficult because they were viewed as an extra weight for the tribe, as they couldn't contribute significantly beyond their mere presence. While there was an interest in increasing the tribe's population, birth control methods were actively used to manage population growth. In ancient indigenous societies, many tribes had natural methods to control childbirth, using herbs and specific rituals to prevent pregnancy. This was particularly useful during tough times when food shortages made it challenging to support more people. Additionally, the lives of women in non-nomadic tribes changed drastically with the arrival of the colonizers. The men in these tribes started seeing opportunities to gain benefits from the new rulers, which led to practices like selling or renting out women and girls, often without considering their feelings or desires. This initial interaction with the colonizers also included the controversial practice of renting women, something that, despite seeming strange, was initially seen as a way to establish good relations, similar to offering a peace pipe. For the indigenous people, the birth of a child with a white father could symbolize a beneficial alliance and bring security to the tribe. Among some indigenous tribes, like the Cree, it was common to designate girls to be rented to white colonizers. This practice, although controversial for ignoring the girls' wishes, ended up establishing diplomatic ties between the tribes and the settlers. Many of these colonizers even married indigenous women, creating a paradox where personal relationships contributed to diplomacy, despite disregarding the individual desires of the women involved. Interestingly, some people believed it was almost impossible to resolve any issues with the tribes without the participation of indigenous women. Over time, many indigenous men, perhaps tired of matriarchal structures and continuous conflicts, saw these arrangements as a way to relieve their responsibilities all at once. Today, the number of indigenous tribes in the United States, which was once over 2,200, has reduced to about 550, most of them living on reservations primarily in the west of the country. There are also some reservations in the north and central regions, but they are rare on the East Coast. Among the largest and most well-known tribes today are the Cherokee, with over 300,000 members, and the Navajo, with about 220,000 people. Besides the Cherokee and Navajo, there are other large tribes like the Sioux and the Chippewa, each with populations just over 100,000 members. However, not all tribes are officially recognized by the government. In recent years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has received over 150 requests for recognition, but only a small number of tribes have achieved this official validation. Official recognition is crucial because it allows tribes to be considered sovereign nations, bringing a range of important rights like managing their lands, creating their own laws, and establishing their own tax systems. Despite these benefits, the recognition process is slow and complicated. On the reservations, even those with sovereignty, the situation remains challenging. Many indigenous people face unemployment, and living conditions are poor, with issues like lack of electricity, limited access to education, and high food costs due to infertile land. These difficult conditions contribute to health problems like diabetes and obesity, as well as a high mortality rate. For many young people, the only way out is to move to the cities or work in the gambling industry, which has become a significant source of income for many tribes, largely because casinos on indigenous lands are not subject to federal taxation. Of course, there are still young people dedicated to crafts, keeping their ancestors' traditions alive. However, the reality is that more and more young people are moving away from the reservations. Most prefer to live outside, seeking better living conditions, and only returning occasionally to visit their families. It's truly sad to see such a rich and unique culture fading over time. Thanks to everyone who watched the video. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for more videos. See you next time.